Hi there, this is the lesson read aloud recording for Lesson 3.02, the Washington Presidency. Have you ever thought about why we have political parties? George Washington thought they were a very bad idea. Jefferson and Hamilton and others like them disagreed on economic policy and how to handle new conflicts with Great Britain. They disagreed on what position the United States should take on the French Revolution. In short, they disagreed on just about everything. Before George Washington's presidency was over, two distinct political parties had formed. Goals for this lesson: identify the first four presidents and the major issues and events of their administrations. Explain the goals of Hamilton's financial plan and the constitutional debate that surrounded it. Describe the rise of political parties in the United States. Recognize the impact of Washington's farewell address. Recognize the major elements of Washington's farewell address. Identify Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital and planned city. Explain the reasons for the rise of political parties during Washington's administration. Identify the major issues on which Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed and their positions on those issues. Recognize the impact of foreign and domestic crises on the development of policies and political parties, the French Revolution and the Whiskey Rebellion. And summarize the key points and significance of Washington's farewell address. Okay, don't forget to go to Lesson Resources and get your reading guide and lesson answer key. And we're going to start by reading pages 203 to 211. Starting with tariffs, taxes, and the birth of political parties. Jefferson and Hamilton also disagreed on the question of tariffs and taxes. Hamilton saw both tariffs and taxes as ways to bring in much-needed funds for the new federal government. First, Hamilton called for a protective tariff on imported manufactured goods, which Americans bought mostly from Britain. The tariff would generate much-needed revenue to pay down the large national debt. At the same time, it would make foreign goods more expensive and thereby encourage American consumers to buy goods made in the United States. In this way, Hamilton hoped the tariff would promote America's small but growing manufacturing sector. By contrast, Southern politicians like Jefferson and Madison preferred lower trade barriers. There was little domestic manufacturing in the South, and planters wanted to continue paying lower prices for European goods. Congress passed some, but not all, of the tariffs Hamilton proposed. At Hamilton's urging, Congress also approved certain taxes on some items made in the United States. Among these excise taxes, as they are called, was a tax on whiskey. Many farmers in western Pennsylvania deeply resented this tax. They had come to rely on selling whiskey, which they made from the grains they grew. Given the poor state of American roads and bridges, these backcountry farmers were unable to move their grain to eastern markets before it spoiled. They could, however, convert their product into liquor, which kept longer and could be transported for sale to the East Coast and abroad. Higher taxes hurt this homegrown industry. The disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson grew more intense in the early 1790s. President Washington, who admired and respected both men, expressed his fervent wish that some line could be marked out by which both of you could walk. Try as though he might, the president was unable to heal the growing rift between his two principal advisors. Competing visions of the nation's future. The issues dividing Hamilton and Jefferson were not simply or even mainly economic. Behind the widening splits were different visions of the nation's future. Jefferson envisioned the country as an agrarian republic, a nation mainly made up of self-sufficient farmers tilling their own land. He did not want to see the growth of manufacturing or cities. He thought a class of wage laborers subject to the will of wealthy manufacturers and businessmen would only undermine the republic. When workers depended on an employer for their livelihood, Jefferson pointed out, then they did not control their destiny and their votes could be bought. Dependence, he wrote, begots subservience, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the design of ambition. Jefferson was also suspicious of any centralized government and believed that the states and localities should hold most of the power. In contrast, Hamilton wanted the United States to be an economic powerhouse rivaling Britain. While he admitted that agriculture would be the principal activity of Americans for years to come, he thought the United States should encourage manufacturing and commerce. Hamilton admitted the success of the British economy. He admired the success of the British economy. He modeled many of his initiatives on those of Britain's highly successful Prime Minister, William Pitt. Hamilton certainly did not seek monarchy for the United States, but he did envision a strong central government as well as banks and financial markets to fuel the nation's expansion. The political differences between Jefferson and Hamilton sometimes seem personal. Jefferson privately suspected that Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but for a monarchy bottomed on corruption. For his part, Hamilton denounced Jefferson as a pretender to profound knowledge and an intriguing incendiary. Temperamentally, neither man had much in common with the other. Jefferson was quiet and reserved. Hamilton, according to a close acquaintance, exhibited a natural yet unassuming superiority. As their disagreements over policy hardened, so did their personal dislike. A split into political parties. Matters grew worse when in the spring of 1791 Jefferson and Madison took a trip through the New York and New England states. Though the trip was intended as a vacation, the two men used their travels to meet with like-minded office holders and plant the seeds of a new political movement. Jefferson's followers began referring to themselves as Democratic Republicans, or simply Republicans, thus distinguishing themselves from the Federalist supporters of Hamilton's policies and of the Washington administration. Jefferson put Philip Freneau, a former Princeton classmate of James Madison, on the State Department payroll. Though Freneau was technically employed as a government translator, he devoted much of his time to editing a pro-Jeffersonian newspaper, the National Gazette. Freneau's newspaper brimmed with vicious but effective propaganda that criticized the president and questioned the motives and reputations of Alexander Hamilton and his followers. In turn, Federalists who supported Hamilton published similar attacks on their own newspaper, the Gazette of the United States. Each side persisted in attacking the other side and trying to win allies. Ironically, even as the gap widened between the Federalists and Republicans, both sides continued to insist that factions, what we now call political parties, were harmful to the Republic. George Washington feared that the growth of these factions and the increasing tension between them threatened to destroy the Republic. In a letter to Hamilton, Washington wrote that differences in political opinions are unavoidable, as they may perhaps be necessary. But he continued, both sides have strained the cords beyond their bearing by pushing matters to extremity. Washington lamented those wounding suspicions and irritating charges with which some of our gazettes are so strongly impregnated. He called for a middle course and yielding on all sides. Without these, he warned, I do not see how the reins of government are to be managed, or how the union of the states can be much longer preserved. The weary president was persuaded to run for office a second time in 1792, and again he won unopposed. But by the mid-1790s there were deep and growing splits in his own cabinet and among the American people. The Democratic Republicans, followers of Jefferson and Madison, saw themselves as patriots still fighting for the threatened ideals of the Revolution. They worried about an increasingly powerful federal government and insisted on a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They assumed that local and state governments would have more power because they were closest to the citizens. Democratic Republicans' ideas mainly attracted wealthy Southern planters, small farmers, and wage laborers in the Southern and Mid-Atlantic states. Federalists, on the other hand, saw themselves as defenders of the Constitution. They argued for a broad interpretation of the Constitution, for allowing the federal government various implied powers not explicitly stated in the Constitution. They championed a strong federal government as the best safeguard against disorder and anarchy. Federalist policies tended to favor the interests of the bankers, merchants, businessmen, shopkeepers, and those who profited from trade. Federalist policies appealed to many in the Northeast, especially to New Englanders involved in transatlantic shipping, commerce, and trade, and to some Southerners who held the same interests. The two parties had different ideas about how best to govern the country, and those ideas tended to pit certain classes and geographic regions against each other. Yet even as the two parties squared off, both remained opposed to the idea of political parties. Each side felt that the position of the other would ultimately undermine the Republic. Responses to the French Revolution. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans differed sharply in their responses to the French Revolution. In July 1789, when French crowds stormed a fortress called the Bastille, a hated symbol of royal power, a new National Assembly came to power in France and for a time ruled with the king. Initially, most Americans enthusiastically supported the French Revolution. After all, France had been a key ally during the American Revolution, and it now appeared that Republican ideals were taking root in French soil. The Marquis de Lafayette, who enjoyed great popularity in the United States, was an early supporter of his own country's transition from monarchy to republicanism. He led crowds in Paris and proudly sent George Washington, his former commander, a key to the fallen Bastille. But by 1793, the French Revolution had taken a much more violent turn, especially with the execution of King Louis XVI and his family. France officially declared itself a republic, and the new leaders embarked on a campaign to eliminate all enemies of the revolution. In this period, called the Reign of Terror, tens of thousands of French citizens were executed, beheaded by the swiftly falling blade of the guillotine. As the French Revolution became more vengeful than liberating, American responses divided. Jefferson, who had been living in Paris when the Bastille fell in July 1789, greatly admired the French revolutionaries and thought the bloodshed perhaps necessary. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, Jefferson told a correspondent. But where the Republicans saw the French Revolution as a triumph over tyranny, Federalists saw mayhem and disorder. Federalists were appalled by the execution of King Louis XVI. He had, after all, signed the Treaty of Alliance with the United States during the American Revolution and sent troops to aid the Americans against the British. In his home, George Washington displayed a bust of the king. Americans had named a town after him, Louisville, Kentucky. Washington worried that the French, in their grasp for liberty, were rushing perilously towards self-destruction. After the American Revolution, France and the United States had signed a treaty according to which, if neither country came under attack, the other was bound to send military assistance. But when Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette were beheaded in early 1793, Federalists argued that America's treaty with France, which had been negotiated with the executed king, was no longer in effect. When Britain declared war on the French Republic in 1793, George Washington sided with his Federalist advisors and declared his official policy of neutrality in the European War. Citizen Genet. In the spring of 1793, a new French ambassador, Edmond Charles Genet, arrived in the United States. His goal was to encourage popular American support for the French revolutionary cause. Genet undertook a 4-week journey from Charleston, South Carolina, to the nation's temporary capital in Philadelphia. Along the way, he stirred up large public rallies and tested the patience of his host, President Washington, by outfitting privateers manned by American sailors to fight against the British, a clear violation of America's policy of neutrality. In Philadelphia, several thousand supporters filled the streets to greet the young French ambassador. They sang Marseillaise, the official anthem of the French Revolution. Gratified by this popular showing of support for Genet, he serenaded those attending a ceremonial dinner with a rousing chorus. Liberty, liberty, be thy name forever, adored forever. Tyrants beware, your tottering thrones must fall. Our interest links the free together, and freedom's sons are Frenchmen all. Not everyone joined in the song. Federalists were outraged at Genet's efforts to drag the United States out of neutrality and into France's war with Britain. But the French, convinced that most Americans disapproved of Washington's neutrality policy, captured and outfitted a British ship, held it at port in Philadelphia, and then sent it off to fight against the English in the high seas. President Washington was infuriated. In August 1793, he asked the French government to recall its ambassador. Even Jefferson quickly agreed that Genet had to go. Genet's dismissal sparked angry protests from many American citizens. Did the president, they asked, aspire to be America's king? When the Pennsylvania Gazette ran a cartoon of Washington being guillotined, the president flew into one of those rages which he does not control himself, Jefferson noted. Washington was increasingly convinced that some Americans wished to stir up popular rebellion and mob violence to undermine the new government. Okay, and we'll stop here and pick up on the part 2 of the Whiskey Rebellion.